Good evening, Goodman Games fans, and welcome to another episode of The Scrivenery. I am Ed Sanick of Reorgan Games, and here's my co-host.
Hi, I'm Trevor Stamper of Blind Visionary Publications, and we have with us tonight the Raven Crow King himself, Daniel J. Bishop.
Hello, everyone.
So, for episode 49, we thought we'd bring Daniel on, and I wanted to talk to him about a blog that you wrote, I believe, like almost a decade ago, right?
A long time back, yes.
A long time back, um, in which the Raven Crow King talks about the three C's. And Daniel, what you meant by that was choices, context, and consequence. And I have to tell you, when I was just starting to think about publishing for Dungeon Crawl Classics and doing third party publishing stuff and working on Tales from the Smoking Room for the first time and stuff. Um, and then again, while we were working through the first issue of the Smoking Worm monographs, which have short um, adventures in them and stuff, one of the things that I did was I found initially I stumbled across this article you'd written, and then I went back and have reread it two or three times since then. And and you put forward a viewpoint that is we're going to talk about. That's the topic of the show tonight. And I have to tell you that this this article that you wrote made me I'm a trained biologist, right? I think about ecology and about the situation of a living environment quite a bit anyway. But this article that you wrote really made me think about it in the context of how to uh, primer players and prime them for decisions, and then follow up, provide them with the context, let them make a choice, and then play through those consequences and everything, which I think is the really the what I took away from as the main meaning of your blog.
Yes,
Um,
I added many, many more words, but that is a gist.
that is the gist, right? And I think there's three parts to the initial blog, and then for those of you who may
Many more words.
many more words, and then the article itself was kind of reformatted and then republished in a Purple Sorcerer
Duck,
publication, right?
purple duck.
Purple Duck, yeah. One of your blog kind of summary books.
Dispatches of Riven, or from the Riven Crow King. I
It
think of volume two.
was it volume two? I was thinking
I
volume five
think it
off
was
the top of my
volume
head,
two.
but you're probably right. Yeah, nice orange cover, and so if you want to have, I actually purchased that through print on demand through drive through, and have it on my bookshelf with the rest of my zines and everything, and actually I go back and think about it, make little notes in the margins and stuff. Um, so you know, like I said, this article, which we're not going to slog through the whole thing tonight, but we're going to talk. It talks about you know contextuality, sensory input, and the complexity of ecology and dungeons and everything, and things to do to make the situation the players is the way I take from it. Right, you're providing contextual clues. Those clues should clue players in if they're listening and paying attention, as to possibilities that might be ahead of them, and that provides them with a choice. And choice is always a good thing when it comes to dungeon creation. And it doesn't have to be a dungeon; it could be a hex and everything and stuff like that.
It's true for any game of any type.
Any game, right? And so recently, I was for a local group. We were playing James Bond 007, which is not DCC, obviously. We were working through one of their published modules and everything, but it was something that I was providing, players with these contextual clues to help them work through it. And it's a once you get the knack of what you're doing, and everything, you'll come up with your own style. I believe most people have, their own style when they do that. But I do find that players really respond to it well. So, like I said, three C's: choices, context, and consequences. What I mean, I've said what I got out of the article. What was your intention when you were writing it? What was the
Okay.
situation? Were you frustrated?
The first thing I want to say is that if that article helped in any way, shape, or form the stuff that appeared in Smoking Worm, it was well worth it because I'm a big fan.
Well, thank you very much. I
Um,
appreciate that.
the goal at the time was, I believe it was during the 4E era when you were getting these official adventures that were put out the map, the players start turning on the map, and they're going to go over there.
Yeah.
And they were very linear.
Hmm.
Yes.
Um, Basically, the gameplay was devised so that the choices that the players experienced, apart from how they handled combat, were kind of meaningless to me.
I think 4E especially was written for people who were not RPGers long term. It was written for a new crowd of trying to pull in a new crowd of gamers who were used to perhaps computer games as opposed to an RPG.
Yeah, but even then, like the thing that D&D or DCC or James Bond or whatever does better than any computer game will ever do
Hmm.
is give you a free range of choice.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
You know, so I have had the good fortune to twice now be able to teach a high school class on this uh, as a what they call in Canada here a supply or a guest teacher.
Oh, very cool.
And each of those things I start with the question, who here has played Snakes and Ladders? And everyone has. And then you say, well, who is still playing Snakes and Ladders? And unless somebody has a really young sibling or a child or something, nobody is still playing Snakes and Ladders because you make no choices.
No, it's completely random, essentially, right?
Yes, there's nothing actually interesting about the game. Once you've gotten past it, let's just see what happens.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Uh, I believe strongly that the reason we want to play these games is because we make meaningful choices that actually affect the outcome of the game. The story we're telling is not you might write a really fantastic adventure, but the actual adventure is what gets played at the table, not what you wrote, not what you intended.
Hmm.
No plan survives the players,
Yeah.
and that is actually something to be encouraged, not discouraged.
Right. Yeah. And I've been running games for an order of 40 plus years, and occasionally I have an
Me too.
opportunity to someone who's a new GM will ask for advice, and I always say the same thing. I say my number one piece of advice for new GMs is the same, and every single new GM ignores it, and I get it because I did too, and that is do not overscript. And I understand because I've been there too. You have this cool story you want to tell, but people don't recognize, don't understand the story is not for the GM to tell, it's for the players to tell. The GM is creating a context in which the players can tell the story. And if the GM railroads this so that the players don't have true choices, my response is always, well, then you don't need me here. You can tell the story, and I don't need to show up. I have better things to do with my time.
Yes. There can be even worse where you get punished for making a choice other than what the GM wanted, which is I've had some sad experience of, but overall, even when I go back, I started in grade school back in 79, 80, and that was something that really struck me right from the beginning. I was lucky that way. I didn't know why that was what I was doing. Years and experience have changed that, but that did seem to be something I managed to get right from the get-go.
Well, then you were ahead of the curve, I'll tell you that.
Yep. So you wrote the article in a response to the gaming environment at the time. Uh,
Yes.
but I still think that, like I said, what you wrote is not invalid today,
It's
right?
timeless. Yeah, timeless advice for
It's
RPGs.
timeless advice. So I thought what we could do
I will take that.
is take a couple minutes and go through the three C's and talk about each one,
Yes.
um, and everything, and then have a play through a couple of scenarios because the Scrivener's real focus is in helping third-party publishers publish better, do something more. And so, how would we address two examples that I've got laid out here? We've all published things, um, and so we all have that experience and stuff. So, Ed, do you want to lead us off on the first C,
Sure.
choice?
Yeah, and so this one I'm really quite passionate about myself too, because like I said, this is always my go-to for advice for GMs. Having been on the opposite end of the spectrum, there was in fact, one game that we were in, brand new GM, and he was taking a literature class in college, and
Ooh.
he had written a novel which was the adventure we were doing. And anytime any of our actions deviated from the plot of his novel, he would railroad it back to the plot of his novel. And that, I can't tell you how quickly that gets old. Um, I kind of wonder sometimes some of the adventures that I've got, all I give is an enormous amount of context, and then I don't give a quote unquote plot. I just say, all right, GM, here you go. Here's the information you need to respond to what the characters choose. And I hope that there's enough people who see that and receive that and understand the context that it's in. So you tell us now why for the particularly I think for the new author out there, for the new author or new GM, why is this issue of choice so key, and what does it look like when it goes well? What does it look like when it's not done well? And how can either an author or a GM make sure that they uh, respect this notion to make a good game?
Okay. So it's important because fundamentally it is why we do this as players. Um, you go to work if you're going to work, most of us do, and you have home life, and you have a lot of things where your choices are curtailed by the necessities of our society and the necessities of our families and life. There are things that have to get done. You might have things in the game that have to get done, but you certainly don't want to have things in the game that have to get done in a particular way to please your boss, who is the GM. Uh, the relationship is different. If you're looking at saying that a game is in a way escapist fantasy, that escape is really that you're doing something meaningful. And if somebody else is scripting you, you are not doing anything meaningful.
Yes.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, even it's sad that we have to play fantasy games to get the illusion of choice. But I mean, the reality is that's the point of the game, is to provide a situation, a scenario, a backdrop, a location, whatever, a setting, and then as the judge, and then let your players echo off of it, right? And make choices. And so, like, my philosophy as a game master is to provide a backdrop. I provide an event, and I maybe plot why that event happened, so I know how it happened and who those key players are. And then I provide, you know, players. I let them drive the narrative of where we go, and some things get left behind, and maybe we'll come back to them. There's always ways to weave story back in, but let players still have, and that actually is an important point, right? The choice to not follow a path is a choice.
Yes.
Which can be
And it,
frustrating if you, as the GM, have spent a lot of time on what that path would look like, but you got to be able to let that go.
Yeah.
yeah,
So you asked what it looks like when it's done right.
Mm-hmm.
and what it looks like when it's done wrong.
Mm-hmm.
When it's done right, because the players know they're making real choices, context is important and they actually care about the world. The details you are giving them make a difference because they actually make a difference. Uh, if it is done wrong, you can go throughout the internet and get all kinds of examples of that. Somebody will say, my players are doing silly things. Why is that happening? My players are like players will test to see how far the bounds go. And if they don't believe that you are offering them choices, they will test that theory. So
Mm-hmm.
if you end up in a situation where your players are really going off, I don't want to say off the rails because there shouldn't be rails, but doing things that don't make sense within the context of the game world that they're in, it is in general because they don't believe that they actually have that choice.
Right. And I would agree with that. And I also think that we're going to come back to this part of this conversation when we get to the third C, consequence.
Yes.
Right. And so I don't want to get out of order and everything, but choice means that players decide the direction of play at some level. Now, if we're looking at the context of a dungeon where at some level, structures are built with, a very specific pathway that you move through them. And that's just part of human nature, right? How do you deal with those types of situations, right? How do you deal with, I mean, it's okay to have confinement, right? As long as players still have choice. And I think it's important to recognize some standard. There's always the possibility of a choice, usually of retreating, right? Unless they've triggered
Yes.
something and collapsed
Uh,
something and they're stuck.
if you find yourself in a good game,
Yeah,
suddenly deprived of choice because of it, because that is a consequence of something that you've chosen, your immediate goal has to be to regain choice.
yeah,
Like if
that's
you're
what it should be,
trapped, how do I get untrapped?
right? How do I solve this problem? And there needs to be a solution, and that's a useful thing to think about.
It's
Um,
useful to think about what a solution may be, but it is also useful to remember that just because you didn't think about it as a solution does not mean it is not a valid choice that could solve the problem.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I try to emphasize that as well with people new to GMing. The players will not do what you expect. It's almost universal. Now there are certain situations where they'll probably come pretty close, but you have to recognize that there are going to be points where they will choose something radically different from what you even considered. And so, yeah, it's helpful to have some things prepared, or as an author, it's helpful to provide some, well, here are some possibilities. And sometimes I'll put like a list. Here are some things that they might do, and here's how some of those could play out. But again, maybe they'll choose, none of the above. And the GM has to be okay with that.
Yep.
Yeah, and the way the GM responds is that third C is the consequence part. When I structure scenarios, I try to put myself, for instance, I've been working on a project for a while now called House of the Petrified Frog, and it's a sandbox set piece. It doesn't have a plot. It's just a thing you can plunk in. It's a little hidden place for a cult, leader, right? And or whatnot. You can just plunk this in anywhere. The idea is that it is highly detailed, provides a lot of sensory input, right? So a lot of context as to what's going on. But it's still not clear always. So there are choices to be made, and the the careful choice, the careful use of choice is really important, right? If you just go through and ignore what I've told you the consequences of the choice are, then you're going to get yourself in trouble. But it's kind of a thinking person's scenario. It's intended to be.
Mm-hmm.
When I developed that, I wasn't thinking about, what is it that I wasn't thinking about the scenario being, particularly challenging. I was thinking about if I'm a hidden cult leader that has these resources, how would I populate my space to prevent people from getting in? Right? That's the thought, and everything. And now that does, there are limitations to what that person can do, but it's always there, and there are choices to be made. So once we establish that choice is the paramount, it is the crucial moment of a role-playing game, right? It is the thing that players do whenever they take an action. um, the next C is context. Okay. So how does context in your mind, Daniel, how does it facilitate or impede choice?
Okay, so context is basically what you know that allows you to make a meaningful choice. And the context can be active, where you don't have to do anything, it just comes in, or passive, I don't know which way you want to put it. They can just come to you as a player, or it might be things you have to seek out to get more information. Not every bit of context is going to be straightforward. Not every bit of context is going to be accurate. Everyone is familiar with from the early days of D&D on to current things now, where you get a rumor table, and some of
Yeah.
the rumors are false.
Yep.
You know,
And as a
those
matter of
are made to drive choices there to give you some background, and you have to think about what you're seeing. Does this make sense? Does this not make sense? Um, and like you were saying, it rewards your participation in the game. The more you participate, the more you can see the context for what it is. I don't think that there's anything wrong with misleading context, as long as it's fair misleading context. Uh, many years ago, I discovered that you could write a room description and talk about the webbing in the corners and the piles of bones and all these things, showing you that there is a giant spider hiding in the ceiling. And then you say, and in the far light, your torch catches a glitter of gold. And almost every player, in my experience, will focus laser like on that gold.
Yeah.
That is perfectly okay. You've given them all the information they should have.
Well, in that sense, it's actually fairly realistic. I mean, because quite frankly,
Yes,
humans will often, as our nature,
yes,
there's a
that is
certain
true.
thing we will latch onto, and often uh, with blinders to a whole lot of other extremely useful sensory input.
Yeah, a giant spider.
Yep.
Um,
So Daniel, do
so
you believe that everybody should have equal access to context?
no,
Not the amount of context, but if I've got five players sitting at the table and they each have a character, right? Does every character need to get the same pieces of context?
no.
Or okay,
Let's say
one,
that you have a group of 5 players, and one is a cleric of Justicia, and one is a warrior, and one is a wizard with an 18 intelligence. Well, there might be context that the cleric gets that the others don't get.
yeah,
The elf might notice a secret door that nobody else notices. The warrior might be aware of the relative strength of an opponent based on something, whereas the 18 intelligence wizard might get a little bit more. It doesn't really matter because in a communal game, that is all going into the pot belonging to the characters. But it's completely okay to say, like, your guy has a 3 intelligence. I'm not going to tell you what that says. You can't read.
yeah,
I think one thing that's helpful in this regard to keep, especially if this is say a campaign where you've got ongoing adventures. If you've got just a single situation that maybe there's a lot of concealed things, traps and so forth. Okay, obviously your thief or your elf is going to have an edge on versus other party members. But on a broad swath of ongoing campaign, I think it's helpful for the GM to try to have different scenarios which will so that each class has some meaningful engagement. Now, again, you don't want to do that in such a way that you've robbed choice, but I think that at least providing some, whether it's different scenarios or different clues within each scenario, um, so that regardless of the character that a person has developed, they feel like I have a part to play just from the standpoint of you got to remember there's a player that's attached to that character, and that
Yes.
you want the game to be fun and engaging for every player.
Um, this was really true in like AD&D and early D&D, and is, I believe, really true in DCC that your characters have niches.
Hmm.
Later D&D tried to make them kind of all the same with different, you know, different skinning of the power, but it's basically the same. Uh, but when you have different niches, you have different ways to approach the game. So the choices you're going to make are based on the strength of your character. Like the thief is likely to try to be sneaky, a warrior in plate mail is not. Might, that's perfect fine too, right? And that's not only a good thing, that is kind of the spice of the game.
Hmm.
So if you look at a not just a scenario, a given encounter, you might have different ways to approach it depending on who you are.
Hmm.
Yeah, and coming at it from our player's perspective, to me, that's the rewarding thing about playing a different class. Like, I'm currently playing in a Lankmar campaign, and I'm playing a wizard, and he is wholly uninterested in non-wizardly things, right? He will routinely, when the players get too involved in something that is outside of his purview of interest, he'll pull the party back and say, "Hey guys, why do we care about this? There's like something we need to go steal, and I've got spells to cast, or I need to do this. This is my goal." And so I find thinking, about that character from the character's perspective of, I'm looking for hidden knowledge, I'm looking for power, these things that's my character concept, and actually actively reminding players, characters, hey guys, why are we bothering to save the orphans? Can you give me a top five list of why I care
Okay,
about this?
so there, your choices include adding context the choices of everyone else at the table.
Yeah,
God, is that a nice thing?
yeah. And I find that not only do I get a giggle out of, from my player, my friends, right? Because the guy's clearly out, but it also helps us, focus on why are we doing what we're doing before we, because you could just kind of randomly wander throughout the city of Lankmar and do stuff. But there are,
Forever.
yeah, you can get a lot of trouble that way. Um, so one of the ways in which I think of context when I'm producing products now is, first of all, I have to tell you, I'm so happy you brought up rumor tables. In the Smoking Worm, over the last year, I have fully embraced rumor tables. You'll start seeing them more and more. I'm doing rumor tables for new patrons now. So, what have you heard about this entity, if you've heard anything? Um, I'm also doing, rumor tables when we produce adventures. I will sometimes put in rumor tables ahead of time. Especially if it's a, like I said, a place setting, or I'm just plunking down a place setting. Here's a useful table of rumors with a little note on the side that has a column that says, "Is this true or false?" Right? So that, about, like I said, about this, I'm working on this House of the Petrified Frog, about it. Here's a rumors table. Here's whether it's true or false. And really, that's a I feel a useful tool for a judge to plunk in anywhere, right? Um, and so, and it's useful to have false rumors.
Yes.
I do believe that you're absolutely right that not every piece of contextuality has to be correct. As a matter of fact, that makes it more enticing, right? Oh, is that real or is that a red herring?
And in adventure writing,
Yeah,
it should be noted that because we're talking about choice earlier, context is not just for the players, right? The players make a choice that puts the expected action off into some new direction. The context that the judge has or the GM has is what allows that person to then take that new direction and run with it because they understand enough of what's going on that they can do that.
yeah.
That's
And so
all context.
yeah, and as opposed to, but you know, from a design viewpoint, there's a balancing act, right?
Yes.
And I point out um, the Fantasy Flight games, Warhammer 40,000, the Heresy, Dark Heresy product line, and its associated products, right? There were a couple of games all associated with it. I was a playtester for a good portion of that, and one of the consistent playtest responses we would have was, you've given us a 96-page module of which 60 pages are backstory. It's impossible to understand what's going on, right? Not because you can't, but just there's so many pages of material that I have to read that 6 or 7 times, and I literally make notes to myself to understand
Yeah.
what.
Those notes are probably what should have been in there.
That's exactly right, right? And so one of the things that I've been doing is trying to make things not always bulleted, but as precise and as short, as active voice, as brief and as concise as possible, right? We only have so much space. I don't need to write you a book. You can read a novel for that. Um, but you'd have to get a point across. And one of the ways I've thought about doing it recently, we've been testing this out on a couple new adventures that I've been writing, is this idea of um, sensory cue cards. And so when you walk into a scene, the three of us walk into a bar, right? Ed is looking for the guys that have baseball bats up against the leg of the bar. Daniel's seeing, that there's some thugs in a corner, and Trevor's seeing something else. And even though we're all seeing the same bar, there are little details that everybody picks up. And so I randomly seed additional contextuality into that, and then tie it into a luck check as they're moving through, that region or that space or whatever. There's clues you can pick up, some of which are misleading. And I find that by handing it to a player, that gives them narrative agency to either tell people, not tell people, make a decision what they're going to do with that information. Many of them withhold it for later, right? And so it allows them. Basically, I'm giving up some control to allow them to introduce something to the group. Um, and in all the playtests I've done with that so far, the players absolutely love it. It creates, it basically gives them an impetus to give them additional choice. I'm literally telling them, I don't care what you do with this information, but you
There
should
you
do
go.
something. Yeah, here you go. And so that in itself, this idea of contextuality is something that I've been spending a lot of time paying attention to design wise. They don't have to take up a lot of space. It doesn't have to be true or false. It could be one or the other, or it could be partially true and partially false. And what I do is I have found that instead of reading it to players out loud, I put it on cards and then just hand them the card. Here you go. There's a piece of context. Sometimes they need to make a will save or sometimes there's some things they have to do. And sometimes it's just like you're really feeling constrained, or, I've got a scenario that I'm running where people are in environmental hazard suits for a game I'm working on. And one of the things I'm reminding them of how uncomfortable those are over time and stuff like that. So, I'm giving them things like, man, this is just really, you're really confined. And letting them have the freedom to work through that. And every time they get those cards, they make different decisions. No moment is the same. They still get to the end, but every
Yeah, but you get to be surprised.
Yeah, and that's
Like
really
Mhm.
cool.
that is, I can't understand why somebody would want to run the game and not get that joy of something fresh.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
I find it really neat when the players come up with there's a problem situation and they come up with a approach to the problem that I had absolutely never predicted, and that's like, wow, that's
Yeah.
brilliant.
Yeah.
I think
And
in good.
go ahead. No, Ed,
I
please.
think another importance of context that I don't want us to. I think would be remiss to not point out. Um, for me at least, and you guys can say if this is significant for you. I feel like a game has so much more richness and enjoyable factor the more that I can engage in suspension of disbelief, the more real it feels. And so when I'm putting together, even if what I'm putting together is a very dungeon crawlish thing, it should make sense. There should be a reason why these things are happening. When I was 10 years old, and maybe it was fine at that time to just go down a hallway and bash in a door and kill some goblins, and I didn't really care why there were goblins in there. At this point, certainly with anything I'm writing, I'm always thinking, um, I want to use this monster here. Well, why is it there? What is its past? What is it doing when there's not adventurers in here trying to kill it? Um, why? And so having a history and having a an environment that makes sense, that is reasonable within, of course. Yes, there's different quote unquote rules when it's a magical environment and all these kind of things. But to have things seem that there's a logical reason why things are happening. Um,
Internal consistency.
yeah, and that reason is for some things will be apparent to the players, and for sometimes it won't. Sometimes that reasoning is figuring it out is part of the adventure, is the mystery behind it. But um, if it's so much more immersive, in my opinion, if uh, if it makes perfect sense why this thing is there and why these events are happening and why this such and such has come to pass.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have to tell you guys, let me share an anecdote. The first time I played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I was 10. And I was on Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, and the kid across the street had D&D. I didn't. Um, Oddly enough, the first game I went and bought at about that same time was James Bond, which, by the way, I owned since age 10 and only got to play for the first time last year.
Oh,
I've literally carried this thing around for 40 years, right? Waiting for a moment to play it. And it was so fun to sit down with a group of guys and play it. But when we played D&D, I was 10. I had no idea what was going on. I'd go across the street. This kid would be working on a he'd be working on a dungeon. You would just have a hex, or you just have a grid, yeah, a grid of paper, and he'd be sitting there making tunnels and rooms and everything and stuff. And his parents would put the tent up in the backyard during the summer, and we'd go out there all night and play D&D. And literally, we would work alphabetically through the monster manual, right? The first monster, the second monster, the third monster, the fourth monster, all the way to the end. And then we would go backwards, back through. I distinctly remember spending an entire night just fighting every monster in the monster manual. Clearly,
what
we
level were you?
no idea. I have no idea what I was.
Because
I was
some of those would have stumped you.
It should have stomped me,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's just me and three or four other guys, and we're sitting there, and we've got bags of candy and soda, and we're just there's no context, there's nothing. It's just you walk into a room and there's this, and then you walk into the room and then there's this, and
And when
and
you're
so
that age, that's fine.
when you're that age, that's fine, that's perfectly acceptable. But today That's not what I'm looking to build as something that I play or something that I want others to play that I've written. And so it's just interesting to think about context. And I gotta point out, I think that's what's so refreshing in some ways about Brandon LaSalle's X-Crawl classics is the new set of contextuality for dungeons and everything, right? That he's completely turned on its head
Hmm.
the idea of ecology. It's not necessarily relevant anymore because there's a broader meta ecology of
It's
the
a
setting.
sport.
Yeah. So now it's a sport. It's like playing football, right? And so that to me is very enticing from a design viewpoint. And I could see some cool things to do with that. So, we've talked about choice, we've talked about context. The last big C is consequences.
Yeah, and
You've done something and something happens.
if you don't have consequences, then you truly have choice? I mean, you may have an illusion of choice, but if what transpires,
It's the same in either way. It doesn't matter.
right,
Yeah.
then why did I then there wasn't really a choice. And I understand there are certain I think there are certain games where there's more of a temptation to set this aside than others. For example, I think that with Call of Cthulhu, a lot of people play it in such a way that their mentality is, well, it's a different kind of game. It's a gothic horror game, and so everything should be overwhelming. It should be deadly, and okay, well, yes, that's true, but still, if 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 whatever I do or my character does, the consequence is still the same, then again I come back to, why did I need to come here? You can I can just listen to you tell a story. There's no point in
Well,
me being part of a game.
I would say that goes back right to choice because you don't really have one. Uh, if you go right or left, the ogre is a quantum ogre, whichever way you go, you don't really have a choice.
Exactly.
And I think that sometimes people fool themselves into believing that their players don't know. But that's when you get the player who is testing everything because they kind of do know.
Mhm.
Well, I'll go back and with the other way then.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And and to me, to talk about your Call of Cthulhu type of scenario like that, to me, the choice comes from not interacting with Cthulhu, right? It's a nearly omniscient, kind of ambivalent creature, but the minions that are under its sway,
Mhm.
right? Because then you're battling humanity, and and so that at that point, that to me it becomes interesting, that conversation of, you've got a whole bunch of cultists, and but they're human. What is it that humans, it allows you to focus on the horror aspect of poor choice or bad choices or evil choices, right? And
Well,
react to those.
just as an example, I played a couple of games at Origins with this one particular GM for Call of Cthulhu. And on the one hand, she was really good at telling a creepy story, and that's part of the reason why I signed up for a Call of Cthulhu game. But on the other hand, she had this, I don't remember how it was tracked now, but basically she had a kill counter. She took great pride in how many characters she killed or drove insane. I got a news flash. You are the GM. This is not a challenge. There is no challenge to killing characters when you're omnipotent. And so I came away from those games having the sense that, okay, I had the illusion of choice, but okay, if I go into this building, the creepy tentacle monster kills me. If I don't go into the building, the creepy tentacle monster comes out of the building and kills me. And so the consequence really is the same regardless of what I choose, and the consequence is always going to be my death and or insanity. And I understand the game has a certain vibe, but I still want to have a sense that it matters
Yeah.
what I do. Maybe it's one kind of horror versus another kind of horror, but it's still horror, and that's fine. But it should matter in some way.
Yeah, and that's my point is what I when I find games like Call of Cthulhu, you know, useful to play and enjoyable is when you're matched with people who can provide you with that choice, right?
Hmm.
And when you're matched with something that's you know omnipotent, it's not useful. It is the same thing as you microwaving a petri dish, right? And those microbes wondering why they didn't get a choice. There's no contest there. And like
Hmm.
you said, yeah, I'm not sure I agree with the idea that a judge should be keeping count, or that's the point of it.
I don't know what killed Hallie, but I do use a dead Sam,
Yep.
Hmm.
and that is enormous fun for players. It's part of the showmanship of running the game. In a game like Call of Cthulhu, where the outcome is almost certainly death or madness, how you get there should have multiple end states.
Yeah.
I am sorry, like your choices have to matter.
Yeah.
Uh, I
Yeah. And
will
I
point
and
out that I wrote Arbitrander, which is a bit of a Call of Cthulhu type scenario in DCC. And you could well die. It's a funnel. There's a good chance a bunch of people are going to die. But how they die and what they do really does affect the end state of the game.
yeah, I would agree with that. And when I ran Arwich for my group, they were horribly repulsed, which mission accomplished. And B, they figured out a way to go and motivate more people to come back and stomp out the evil, right? And or at least take a stab at it. And so, there was it was a really interesting and engaging scenario to work through. So so consequences. How do you as a judge or as a writer and a designer, how do you address consequences in your product? What do we do? Do we overtly make a list of consequences? If this happens, then that happens, or if players do this, then remember this. How do
Well,
we make consequences?
it depends upon the actual scenario, but so in some cases you will just note the likely consequences.
Yeah,
Hmm.
If they go back to the village and tell them what happened, likely the village will see them as the villains. Not
yeah,
always, likely. Uh, if they burn down the house and say they were too late, likely nobody else has to know how horrible everything was.
that's right.
That's those are obvious consequences. On the way up there, there's a bit where they say, "Well, I never did this certain thing that all of the village is partaken of." In which case, well, there is only one possible consequence, then those characters are dead,
Yeah,
and they've been dead for a long time. So what are they now? And you just look at what, for me, look at what the likely things are that players are likely to do and know what the broad answer is, or in some cases specifics. If it's like you need to make a saving throw or this happens, it's either this happens or possibly roll in this chart or whatever the consequence is, right?
yeah.
Consequence of combat could be you defeat the monster, could be you die, could be the monster runs away, could be you run away, could be you're knocked unconscious and you have to make the roll the luck check to see if you're alive.
And so a lot of those consequences are kind of assumed, right? You defeat the monster,
Yes.
you're probably going to move on to the next room or hallway or whatever. And
Well,
and
no. You defeat the monster, and now you have a choice as to what you're going to do. Not
yeah,
assuming that that is the new context for the next set of choices.
Hmm.
And that always keeps rolling throughout the game. When players get stuck, they don't know what to do. It's time to introduce another piece of context. There's a order or a sound or a wind or a door slam somewhere. It doesn't have to be much. It just has to be enough to give them the sense that
Context has
they need
evolved.
to make a decision,
Yeah.
possibly a clue as to what the consequences of the decision could be. Go left, you go right. Well, what did the hallways look like?
Yeah. So can you design for that? Or is that something that is best left to an essay or discussion with, a judge to judge essay and discussion about how do you pick up context and consequences to help people move along, when they're stymied. And I ask that because, you know, um, part of my home role playing games sessions, a large part of those sessions, not every week, but routinely, is the entire group having a conversation about all of the context that they're aware of and making a decision about what they should do next, right? And weighing choices and saying, do we go after this? Do we go deal with this person? Do we investigate this? You know, my group, and maybe I'm just very lucky, but well, actually right now my current weekly game are people I've been playing with for 25, 30 years. So we have that blessing of they're very familiar with our style. We're very good, we work well together, but they still have extended conversations about what is the next step, where do we need more information, what have we missed, type of a thing. um
Uh, you may or may not be aware that the other bit where I've talked about how you should get at least 2 hours play per hour of prep and hopefully more. Every time your players stop and worry about the consequences and what the choices are that they have available to them, you've just gotten more play out of your prep.
yeah,
That is a good thing, not a bad thing. That is a wonderful thing. Uh, you can design for like Belmorphos when I wrote that. You have some tunnels that are flooded, some that are canted, so an earthquake has tilted the tunnel. It does give you some context right away for what you want to deal with as a group.
right,
Uh, if the judge understands the scenario, and I don't think you can plan ahead of time for how the judge moves the scenario if it stalls. Sometimes you can if you know there's a pain point.
yeah,
But in reality, that is something you learn by doing, by
yeah.
talking about it, by writing essays, by doing. Uh, and the third point in it has gone out of my head. I am sorry.
Well, I think
No,
you
that's
certainly
okay.
can have um, discussion, or and sometimes I even reduce mine to a bulleted list, but it's mostly there to provide just some tips for the GM who's going to be using the adventure. I'll preface it as, here's some of the things, here's some of the likely approaches that a party might take, and here would be the consequences of some of those possible routes. And then I always throw in, but of course, your mileage may vary. It may be completely different from, nothing. It may be none of the above. But I feel like that helps give the judge who's reading it a little bit more ability to be able to react and respond fluidly and quickly. Um, and so, I feel like it's a helpful thing, just so long as I'm not presenting them there as formulaic, or as this is how it has to be. It has to be one of these things, etc.
Yeah,
I know the thing I was going to say, which is that a game system that is designed to include extra ways that players can get context. The reason there is these spell like second sight
Hmm.
yeah,
is specifically to allow the players to choose to get more context.
Hmm. Detect evil, detect magic, same kind of thing.
Yes.
yeah. And so when, I often hear players talk about those as weak spells, and what that tells me is they don't play in scenarios where that kind of information is useful.
Yes.
Right?
Knowledge is power.
Yeah,
See, I consider spells like that to be hugely valuable as a caster.
yeah, yeah. But many people don't, right?
Hmm.
And as a matter of fact, I have often heard, judges talk about, hey, these are the weaker spells in DCC simply
What?
because they're not offensive, right? They're not. It's not fireball. It's not. You know. You know. Prismatic spray or whatever, color spray, right? There. And while those are useful spells, I absolutely agree. You know, the ability to sense something in a way that is not standard is incredibly helpful.
Oh yeah.
But it's only helpful if your judge includes that in the game, right? If they allow for it.
Hmm.
And so one thing that I find, and that is almost impossible. Well,
Have
I
you
have,
heard judges complain about that?
yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
That always blows me away because here you have a player asking you, please tell me more.
yeah,
And
Right.
and they're like, well, then I lost the scenario. Go, no, wait, no, you've made this choicing so much more rich.
yep,
You won't have the surprise then. Get the surprise now. What's the problem?
yeah, yeah,
Well, and the wrinkles that it can add, and I find wrinkles as in unexpected quote unquote plot twists to be the spice of the game. And the wrinkles that those spells can add, you've got this scenario set up where the party comes across some seemingly innocuous people, but turns out one of them is a powerful assassin and is just about to, or maybe some extra is a demon or something like that. It's just about to jump the party first chance they get, and someone casts a detect magic, and this adventure's just took on a whole different spin now, and that those kinds of things add to me. That's
Yes.
spice of the game.
yeah. One of the, I
And
guess,
and the fact that you weren't expecting that to happen is like, thank you.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. One of my design philosophies now, when I play test things, is I am specifically looking for players being able to handle the situation differently as many times as possible, but still come to a good conclusion, right? And so they make many choices. And so what I like is if I run, say, a playtest 7, 8 times, and every single time plays differently, but they still are able to tackle the problem. That tells me that they have lots of options
Hmm.
and it is still approachable, right? And so, and some of those options may be more difficult than others. I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is that players can maximize their creativity to handle the problem. And if I see lots of different ways to solve the problem, then I'm like, okay, so that is a good interaction. So
Yeah,
that's
ultimately you're setting up a problem and saying solve it.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
Here
and
are some potential solutions, but
And one of the neatest games that I've ever played in, it was uh, a D&D 3.5 game, epic level characters. And on the one hand, I know some people think, well, gosh, by the time your characters get to that point, there's, they're so world stoppers that there's nothing left that's interesting. Oh no no. And this GM had presented for us a scenario where we were related to some interplanar politics that was going on with some very powerful beings. And this one was encroaching on some other territory, and we had to kind of try to get this whole situation resolved. And we could have gone in with brute force and knocked a bunch of heads, but it was made clear to us that would make the overall situation worse and more unstable. And so, okay, you guys have to come up with some way to get to diffuse this circumstance. And after we had done the whole adventure, and the solution was extraordinarily, shall we say, unconventional. I asked the GM, all right, so what was your thought in terms of how we might approach it? And he said, I had nothing in mind, no,
Yeah.
absolutely nothing, because it was so exotic of a circumstance. He didn't even bother trying to figure out, what possible routes would be. He just threw it out there. Here's this thing. What are you going to do? And I think when you can have enough confidence in your player's level of immersion that you can present something, and going into it, you don't even have any kind of sense of, you're not even devoting any kind of energy into, well, how might they deal with this? Then you really have a group that's going to make a memorable game that's going to tell one really cool story that you're going to look back on, a lot of times later and say, remember when the group did this?
But I will say, if you're ready to publish, it's part of your job to think about what the likely things are
Yeah.
that players will do.
Mm-hmm.
It is not your job to make them do those things, though.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But to anticipate and be able to help.
If then,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
not and then.
Yeah, yeah, and absolutely. There's nothing wrong with. In fact, like I've said earlier, thinking about some of those potentials beforehand can certainly help the game flow more smoothly as those things come up, provided that you have the frame of mind that what might happen might be absolutely nothing that's on this list, and that's okay. And in fact, that's probably going to make the game even more memorable than what I came up with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so from that viewpoint, when the only advice I could give a judge is to just be fearless, right? To not be afraid of consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Just you need to be able to respond to players and explain to them what happens and not be afraid of what that means.
If I could uh, just mention one judge that I've encountered who I think does this better than anybody else I've ever played with is Brendan LaSalle. His ability to roll with bizarre things that the PCs do, and just take that and run with it as though that was an intended plot, so to speak, is masterful. And it just goes to show, we can all of us can always get better. And for anyone who has an opportunity to play with Brendan at, say, a con or whatever, I cannot highly recommend it enough.
Yeah.
I second that, and I gotta say, you know, I have certainly put him on his toes more than
Yes,
once. Like,
yes.
I think in Neon Knights, there is a side of what one group did that was us.
That's awesome.
Uh,
Okay. So we've now talked about the three C's. We've got them. We got choice, context, consequences, right?
yes,
We talked a little bit about how a judge or how how a third party publisher can think about these things in context of their design process and how we've done it ourselves. Let's run through an example. So I've got two examples. I'll lay the groundwork for the first one. Example A of the three season play, you have a dungeon of some kind of abandoned and lost deity. Uh, Characters are heading down a stone walled tunnel that splits left and right. The judge knows that there is an owlbear on the right and there is a band of goblins on the left. Okay, the players don't. How do we prep this? How do we design for this? What do we put into our product to help us, to help judges work through, provide choices,
Okay,
provide context.
which one uses the tunnel?
Sorry?
Which one uses the tunnel?
Right. So that's a great question,
Do the
right?
tunnels, do the goblins run out this way or the owlbear? Because I can guarantee you they are both not using that tunnel.
Right. And so that's an idea that's an ecological viewpoint, right? There would be conflict. But let's say for some reason, let's just kind of run through that scenario. What would we expect to see there contextually if they've been fighting over the tunnel because it's their only access point?
Dead goblins.
Dead goblins,
Hmm.
right?
It
Because
has
the
to be.
owlbear's gonna mop them up. And so
Well, it's not just because the owlbear is going to mop them up, but if the owlbear lost, there's no owlbear down the right.
that's right.
Hmm.
So so thinking about that. Now, let's say one of them has an exit, and we'll give it to the owlbear, right? How does that change the context or the contextual clues we
Okay,
might leave in that
so
scenario?
the tunnel leading to the owlbear's domain, presumably the owlbear is not using, or again, the goblins have a serious problem, and they're probably not using it. So perhaps it is choked with debris. It's difficult for the owlbear to get down, but if you should go down there, the animal odor gets stronger and stronger the farther you go.
Yeah. And since the goblins have maybe choked it with debris, maybe there would be some evidence of the nature of the creatures that had done that, right?
Hmm.
Maybe
Yes.
they've left some spoilt food behind, or I mean, they're what is it that goblins leave behind, right? Goblins
Rats
store,
probably nothing else.
yeah. So, you know, the idea of what is down the owlbear tunnel is a good one. Now,
So
what do we expect to see?
if you know that the goblins put this stuff in there to try and keep the owlbear out, you also know that the goblins know about the owlbear.
Right.
So you could potentially have a choice when encountering the goblins of them wanting you to get rid of the owlbear. You know, it doesn't have to be a fight with goblins. You have a
Right.
whole nother interesting level of play there.
Hmm. Hey,
Right.
we've got a common enemy. It's the owlbear. Let's go deal with this.
Yeah. And so that sets that up. Now, on the goblin side of the tunnel, if the goblins have command of this and they blocked off the owlbear, what would we expect to see? What kind of contextual clues could we put in
Okay,
place for these
so the
goblins?
goblins require some better protection than just having blocked up the tunnel. They need a way to know there's something moving down that tunnel. There is some sort of checkpoint. You know, the typical D&D thing would be to throw a trap down there. But
Yep.
if you do that, it has to be a trap that can easily turn on and off.
And they can be made by a goblin.
Yes.
You have to
Uh,
factor in too. All right, how are they surviving? How are they getting food? How are they getting water?
I mean, you could have just like some low mounds where you have guards that are posted.
Yep.
Uh,
And maybe they've built, like you said, constriction points, right? Something a
yes,
goblin can get through, but an owlbear can't. Um,
you know, and basically, as the judge or the designer, you're thinking, what did these goblins think like? But let's go DCC wise, and we're making our humanoids mysterious, which is great. So these goblins are actually religious fanatics, and they have the owlbear trapped, not because they're afraid of it, but because they worship it.
Mm,
yeah.
You know, that changes completely the way that it works. So you go to the left into the goblin area, there'll be another way working around to the owlbear area where they can drop you down there if they catch you to sacrifice to the owlbear.
And there might be contextual clues as to what the goblins are doing by having, paintings of owlbears on the wall, right? That are venerated or something. Or,
Yes.
there's contextuality that tells you these goblins don't fear the owlbear, or maybe they do, it's a fearful
But
god,
in a different way.
but they worship it in some way.
Yes. So basically, you have to make up your mind what these things are like. What is their relationship to each other? And then you have to find a way to express that through the design,
Yeah.
or express that through the design.
Yeah, and those clues, and that's the point of good design. The reason why I buy a product is so I don't have to rewrite the product.
Hmm.
Right? That's the goal, that I want to be able to
I
open.
have said I am sorry again and again. I'm kidding.
But you know what I mean. I'll give you a good example. I was running my party through G1 against the Giants, and against the Giants, as interesting a scenario as it is incredibly poorly designed on a how do I run this type of thing. Now, it's also one of the very first adventures written and published, so we should cut it some slack. But I found myself pulling my hair out because it was, there was no space to make notes. There was no way to add things and everything that I felt should be there. Um, without just rewriting the whole thing. And so I found myself often just jotting down little tables of contextual clues or little notes to myself. This should be here. This should be here. They should see this, right? Things that were never included in against the Giants, simply because it is necessary to kind of give your players. I mean, that's the interesting thing. The great part about suspense movies is that they're suspenseful, right? They build
Yes.
to something, and that is contextually based. And in a way, we're trying to mimic that. Um,
And you don't have the payoff of learning what the clues mean if those clues have not been presented.
right?
Hmm.
Absolutely. So okay, so that's a great set of things to consider for this very simple example of a Y tunnel split or a T tunnel split. Um, let's go a little more complex. I want you to think about a hex crawl. Um, the party has crashed a spaceship or any airship or anything. I don't really care if it's a fantasy or science fiction setting or modern, but they've crashed into a space, and the jungle surrounding them, those the hexes on the flower surrounding them, present numerous obstacles, but there is a pathway out, or at least one, possibly two pathways out. What kind of contextuality do we put into these hexes, um, that allow players from the central hex to make a decision? I'm going to go north, east, south, west. Why am I making that decision?
I actually have a thing that I'm working on,
Okay.
which includes a possible a funnel
Okay.
that includes a possible start with a plane crash.
I'm working on one too.
Is the plane crash?
with a what?
Oh,
With a
okay.
spaceship crash. Yeah.
A plane crash into a jungle island, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Uh, maybe we should combine them into one super adventure.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, I will contact you sometime after
Sounds
we do the
good.
show. But in that, you're looking at, okay, they crashed here. There's wreckage. There's what can you salvage immediately?
Yep. All those are
And
important.
you, as the writer, have to know what the place is about and what is around them.
Yeah.
So you can say, what can you see? What can you hear? What can you smell? What does the air taste like? What is basically, what do you know?
Yeah. And if you're going to try, as players should, assess what direction is the best direction for me to go in, you have to be able to provide clues in some level to what they could encounter in those directions. And the first thing, I've play tested this adventure a couple times. The first thing players do is climb a tree, right? They go find the tallest thing they can find, and they climb up to it to look around to see what's around, because they have no because if you're down on the ground in dense foliage, your observation window is incredibly limited, And so they're looking for a way to increase their
Yes.
context. And so that's something that I found that you have to design for. You have to know, okay, I'm going to arbitrarily break these into, a hex flower, right, all the way around your crash site. What is in these directions that might give clues so they can make some kind of informed decision? And I think it's important to say it's okay to leave some areas dark, in my opinion, right?
Yes. That is a clue too.
That's a clue too. And so
You don't know what's there is as meaningful as anything else.
yeah, but what I found is that you definitely have to think about how can my players make a meaningful decision, assuming they feel they should leave the crash site.
Well, and
Or
inaction is a decision unto itself.
yes,
Yes.
Whether you're in a dungeon and you decide, I'm not going to go left or right, I'm going to do something else. Or I'm spending an hour analyzing, well, we could do this, we could do that. You know, not making a move is itself a move.
it is. But when you think about it, when you're designing an adventure you want people to run, right? Um, Designing a scenario where there's no contextuality provided about where they can go
Hmm.
is taking that choice away. You're just saying it doesn't matter what direction you go in.
Oh, I agree. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, you as a GM or author, what would be the consequences of quote unquote not making a choice? Maybe
And
there's, for example, you've crashed this vehicle, you've crashed this spaceship. Might be you hang around there too long and don't go anywhere. Maybe there's poison gas that's being given off from the engine of the spaceship, and you're going to be negatively affected. At any rate, or it the area where it impacted it has created a disturbance in the ground, and it's now, you could have quicksand, or you could have ground shifting that's dangerous. So
If you
even
go the quicksand route, my personal uh, druthers would be that the ship is slowly sinking.
hmm
You have a limited time to make a choice, or this resource is gone.
hmm
yeah, and one of the things that I've been thinking about while I designed this was because it's built like a hex crawl, right? And you have random encounter tables. Um, you know, Thinking about things like, okay, well, you just crashed a shuttle. People might be dead if they don't dispose of their dead properly, right? This increases the likelihood of certain encounters happening. And so those are the types of things that I note,
hmm
and stuff like this. So, if you've got bears in the area or something, things that would scavenge the dead. And I've run into that situation where, man, the first thing I did was drag all the dead people out and put them at the far end of the wreckage site. And then what do they find? They find things encountering, coming to that because they're drawn to that scent. And so part of the design thinking is making sure that you've made, I mean, it doesn't take more than a sentence, right? One bullet, exposed dead will make this encounter more likely, right? And so so yeah, so there's lots of things you have to think about. Um, uh, but I find those challenges engaging, right? And then the question becomes, how do you present that information in a way that is not overwhelming to the judge? So, and that can be challenging in and of itself, like we've talked about, right? Too much dense backstory is hard to absorb in a timely manner and hard to remember when you're on the fly. So, yeah. Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about these things, guys. We've worked through the two examples. We've talked about choice, context, and consequence. Is there any other direction we want to go in, or anything else we feel we should touch on? Daniel?
Uh, I could go on probably forever about this stuff.
Yeah.
Honestly, uh, the best thing to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I find myself as a designer very engaged, like I said, very engaged with the problem and trying to find creative ways to make it accessible, more accessible, and easier to deal with. Um, I guess I would add there are design decisions you can make that facilitate finding information that is not on the page of your encounter, right? So there's an entire design philosophy of a kind of command module where everything is on the two-page spread in front of you that you need to run that encounter. Now there may be multiple of those, or just one. This is one of the reasons why I like smaller format um, zine size things, because I allow you to it allows you to focus on one thing. Um, but certainly the use of pointers, I use manicules in my products now to link things together when it's important that you remember that, oh, hey, that is actually talked about earlier or later, and you need to be aware of it. Um, I'm working on an adventure right now that has a time counter, and we actually created a time counter icon that is there on every part where you need to keep track of time to remind the judge. It sits in the margin where it's very visible, right? This is a point where you need to adjust the time counter. And so those types of things I think are just as important to facilitate the judge creating the contextuality and the consequences they need to. I think there is a whole level of layout and design that's important to talk about that we really haven't engaged with tonight. Um, so
I I have to say, from my experience, I don't have to deal with that. I write stuff, somebody else does the layout. And
yep,
sometimes they do a great job, and sometimes they might not do as good of a job. But
yep,
that's outside my scope. And I'm not
understand.
going to say who I thought did not as good of a job, but not Goodman Games, they always do a great job.
Yeah,
I go just now go through every other publisher, not them, not them, not them. Oh, so it's but like good layout is important.
it is.
Mhm.
It is. Ed, how about you?
So I know in a certain sense this is restating some stuff, but I just feel it's so important. Um, DCC and by extension MCC, XCC, etc. One of the things, in fact, probably the thing that has attracted me most to this game. I've been playing, like I said, RPGs since 1980. I had reached a point where I was getting bored with RPGs because I had everything memorized and that took mystery out of the game. One of the things that makes DCC so cool is the unpredictable nature of it. If nothing else, you look at the way that spells happen, in rolling on a spell chart, and so I would use that as a reminder and to stress to a GM and an author. Do not be afraid of unexpected developments. Embrace them. Um, if you think back to games that are memorable to you, that you recall 15, 20 years later, it's not because someone got a great roll on attacking a monster. It's because somebody did something that nobody else was expecting, and it took the game into a gonzo direction. And those are the things that we remember about the game, and those are the things that make the game so much more rich than, Monopoly or whatever. And so don't again, don't be afraid of those things. Celebrate them. Encourage your players to, if I can use an overused phrase, think outside the box.
I could not agree more.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. So
Well, we want to certainly thank Daniel for joining us for this conversation tonight.
thank you very much, Daniel.
You're very welcome. Thank you for putting up with me.
Absolutely not a problem. So we very much enjoyed having you on. It's always a pleasure to sit and talk with you. I wish it could happen more often, actually. So
Um, well, I am effectively retired, so
awesome.
Okay.
Right.
sorry.
Well,
I have we didn't open up with this, but if viewers have noticed, I have some problems speaking right now. That's related to a degenerative neurological condition. So I'm not working.
Okay, good to
I've
know.
got time.
You've got time. I will keep that in mind. We'll definitely talk afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
And on that note, goodbye until later, Goodman Games fans, and we will check you on our next episode.
That's right.
See ya.
That's right. Have a great evening, everybody.
All right. Don't split the party.